Imagine the kind of stress that guy was under. He was under so much stress he had to get anesthetized every night.
Yeah, I knew there was something that from things I've witnessed about him that I almost felt like an obligation to speak up on his behalf, as he left a void.
He hid in his bathroom and cried. Not once. Not twice. People who stood a few feet away from him say it happened more times than they can count. A man worth $500 million, adored by the entire planet, sobbing behind a locked door because the world he built with his own hands was starting to close in on him. When Michael Jackson died, the story seemed simple. A doctor gave him too much of a drug that was never meant to leave a hospital room. The doctor went to prison. The case was closed. The headlines moved on to the next tragedy. But the people who were actually there, the ones who drove him at 3 a.m, who stood outside his door while he slept, who watched him build an empire while quietly falling apart, they never accepted that the story ended there. And when you sit with them long enough, when you get past the rehearsed answers, a very different picture starts to form. One of his longtime bodyguards remembers a night that still bothers him more than a decade later. He says Michael pulled him aside, calm but serious, and told him something was about to change. Not the music. Not the fans. The people. Now you're going to see them come out, Michael reportedly warned him, the ones who disappeared for years. At the time it sounded like nothing. A passing comment. But once the This Is It tour was announced to the world, that warning turned into a prophecy playing out in real time. Names Michael hadn't mentioned in a decade suddenly resurfaced. Old collaborators. Old friends. People who had walked away when things got difficult were suddenly calling every day, showing up at rehearsals, trying to attach themselves to what was shaping up to be the greatest comeback in music history. His security team says they physically watched it happen, watched a man who had spent years in relative isolation get swallowed by a crowd of people who all wanted a piece of what he was about to become again. And it wasn't just the industry circling him. According to those closest to him, Michael's generosity was something people learned to exploit. He opened Neverland to children who were sick, some of them fighting cancer, and quietly paid for treatments the public never heard about. He let kids stay in his home because their families had nowhere else to turn. But somewhere along the way, that same generosity became the thing people used against him. Allegations followed him for years, allegations his inner circle insists were shaped by people chasing a payout rather than justice. There's no amount of money that would make a real parent walk away quietly if something actually happened to their child, one former staff member said. They went after him for the money. That's what it was. Those closest to him describe watching the toll those years took on him long before any court ever reached a verdict.
He would always have a doctor with him, I think that's very well known now, in another room somewhere, because he felt like he needed the same privileges as the president. He could get assassinated, there were death threats daily.
He stopped trusting easily. He started keeping a smaller and smaller circle of people around him, which, according to more than one former employee, only made him more dependent on whoever remained inside that circle. It's a detail people who study his final years keep coming back to. The very thing that was supposed to protect him, pulling closer to fewer, more trusted people, may have quietly made him more vulnerable to the handful of people who did stay, some of whom, according to his inner circle, did not have his best interests at heart at all. Then there was the deal that, according to people who worked alongside him, may have cost him more than anyone will ever admit. In the 1980s, Michael did something almost nobody in the music industry believed he could pull off. He bought the rights to one of the most valuable song catalogs on the planet, a catalog that included some of the most recognizable music ever recorded. It made him a business force, not just an entertainer. But it also made him enemies. Powerful enemies. People who had wanted that catalog for themselves and never forgave him for getting there first. Owning that catalog changed everything, one associate close to his business dealings explained. It made him powerful in rooms most artists never even get invited into. And some people never got over losing that chance. When asked directly whether that ownership played any role in what eventually happened to him, the answer wasn't a denial. It was silence, followed by, I don't know. I really don't know. But I know he owned something enormous, and his family doesn't own it anymore. People who worked security around Michael during that period describe a strange split in his personality that only became visible once the cameras were off. On stage and in public, he was untouchable, precise, in complete control of every movement. Behind closed doors, according to more than one former staff member, he could seem almost childlike, unsure of who to trust, constantly replaying old conversations in his head, trying to work out who around him actually cared and who was simply positioning themselves for the next payout. You'd see him laughing 1 minute, a former staff member said, and an hour later he'd be sitting alone, completely somewhere else in his head. Nobody talked about that side of him publicly. We just watched it happen. That isolation, according to people who spent years around him, wasn't accidental. Several who worked closely with Michael believe it was deliberately encouraged by certain people in his life who benefited from him staying dependent, staying unsure, staying close to a small circle they controlled. The more isolated he felt, the more he leaned on the people who were already inside, one associate explained. And the people inside knew exactly what they had. They weren't going to let outsiders in easily, because outsiders might tell him the truth. Behind the glittering image of a global superstar, those who protected his family say there was a constant, quiet war being fought to keep his children safe. Michael, they say, was obsessive about giving his kids something close to a normal life, which was almost impossible given who he was. Security recalls receiving threatening letters left at hotel front desks, phone calls that made their blood run cold, situations serious enough that they would pack up an entire family in the middle of the night and vanish without waking the children. They never knew why we were leaving, one staff member said. We just told them it was time to go, and we'd be somewhere new by morning. There were entire tours, according to former staff, where the family barely spent 2 consecutive nights under the same roof, not because anyone wanted that kind of life, but because the alternative felt too dangerous to risk. People think fame is glamorous hotel rooms and applause, one former guard said. For us, it was scanning every hallway before he walked down it. It was memorizing exit routes before we even unpacked the bags. That's what protecting him actually looked like. That fear followed the family for years, and it makes what happened next even harder for the people around him to talk about. Several of them remember exactly where they were the day the news broke. One recalls getting a phone call from a friend who simply said, "Turn on the television." He didn't believe it until he saw Michael's own brother walk to a podium in front of a wall of cameras and confirm what nobody wanted to accept. Everything stopped, he said. I didn't know what my next move was. All I could think about was the kids, what was going to happen to them, what I was supposed to do next.
That was something that I was put in before, and I had to retract because I never want to be into anything that, would hinder my career or my children.
My mind just froze. When people ask what actually killed Michael Jackson, almost everyone close to him gives a version of the same answer, and it's rarely just a drug's name. I tell people he left, one bodyguard said. This world was hard on him. If you ask me what killed him, I'll tell you stress killed him first. Everything else came after that.
Michael Jackson bought Eminem's catalog when he dissed the Mike was gangster, and Mike was murdered because when Michael Jackson purchased the Beatles catalog, that automatically made him 50% owner of Sony Records. Art. Sony Records never forgave Michael Jackson for buying the Beatles catalog.
Another added that he doesn't believe a single person was responsible. He believes it was years of pressure from multiple directions, closing in at once. People who guarded him in his final years describe a level of security most people would associate with a head of state, not a musician. A private physician nearby at almost all times. Daily threats. A man who, according to one former guard, genuinely believed his life was in danger the same way a president's would be. He told me he could be assassinated, the guard said. And he wasn't being dramatic. He meant it.
In your head. It was the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life. I've had other relatives who had passed away, but they weren't my close siblings. They were like cousins or whatever, or friends. But when my brother passed away, it just seemed like my whole inner self just melted.
One of the most revealing memories shared by someone in his circle goes back to the years after his album Invincible was released. On paper, it wasn't a failure. Millions of copies sold worldwide. But when you compare that number to what Thriller achieved, it looked like a disappointment, and Michael reportedly took it as a personal betrayal. A former associate remembers finding him locked in a bathroom, sobbing, convinced the people around him had deliberately sabotaged his work. He told me he spent 5 years of his life on that album, the associate recalled. He said he'd recorded over 100 songs and narrowed it down to the handful that made the final cut, because he wanted it to be his greatest work. And then he told me the label wasn't promoting it the way they used to promote him. He felt like it was intentional. That belief, whether true or not, apparently spiraled into something much bigger in Michael's mind. To fund the ambition behind Invincible, he reportedly borrowed an enormous sum of money, reported by some close to him to be in the range of $200 million, using his stake in that same valuable song catalog as collateral. If the album underperformed badly enough, the debt could force him to give it up entirely. People around him allegedly whispered that this was exactly the point. That the underperformance wasn't an accident. That certain people wanted him buried in debt so the catalog would slip out of his hands and into theirs. What makes this part of the story so difficult to untangle, according to people who watched it unfold, is that Michael genuinely believed he could outwork the situation. He didn't retreat after Invincible underperformed commercially compared to his earlier work. He started planning something bigger, a full return to the stage, a tour that could clear the debt entirely and prove, once and for all, that he hadn't lost his connection with the world. That comeback eventually became the This Is It concert series, the very tour his bodyguard says triggered the flood of old faces suddenly reappearing in his life. In hindsight, several people close to him now believe those two threads were never separate stories at all. The financial pressure and the sudden crowd of new and returning faces were part of the exact same storm, closing in from two directions at once. They convinced him he'd been outsmarted, one source said. That the very people releasing his album had no interest in it succeeding, because if it failed, they'd end up with something worth over $1 billion. Whether that theory holds up under scrutiny is something historians and journalists still argue about today. But inside Michael's world, according to those closest to him, it was treated as a very real and very personal betrayal. There's also long-standing tension tied to that same catalogue and a very famous artist who, according to people in Michael's circle, never forgave him for buying it in the first place, believing he had been the one to point Michael toward the opportunity to begin with. Sources close to Michael describe him coming out of his room in tears more than once, saying he'd been on the phone with someone who was furious with him all over again. He reportedly offered that person several chances to buy the catalogue back over the years. According to those who were there, the offers were never accepted. He was one of the most powerful men in the music business because of that decision, one insider said. And a lot of people never forgave him for it. There were death threats connected to that catalogue too, not just the other allegations everyone already knows about. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that was. Artists, even the biggest ones in history, almost never end up owning the actual rights to music on that scale. They perform it, they profit from touring and royalties, but the deep, generational wealth tied to owning the songs themselves usually belongs to record labels and publishing companies, not to the performers. Michael broke that pattern entirely, and according to people who worked alongside him at the time, he understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just an artist chasing another hit record. He was building something that could outlast his own career, something his children could inherit long after the applause stopped. To the people who resented him for it, that ambition wasn't admirable. It was a threat. Then there's the subject almost everyone close to Michael circles back to eventually, whether they want to or not, the doctors. More than one person in his orbit has said, in different ways, that Michael became dependent on certain medical professionals not because he was reckless, but because he was made to believe he needed them. They were clever about it, one former associate said. Get him used to something, convince him he had a condition that required it, and suddenly you're indispensable in his life. That's how you stay close to someone like Michael Jackson. You make yourself necessary. Several people who spent time around Michael in his final years describe watching this pattern repeat itself with different doctors over different periods of his life, each one seeming to arrive at a moment when he was at his most vulnerable, each one becoming, for a while, one of the only people he felt he could rely on. It wasn't one bad doctor, one former associate argued. It was a pattern that kept happening to him over and over, for years. And every single time, the people around him who actually cared had a harder and harder time getting close enough to stop it. The man ultimately convicted in connection with Michael's death served roughly 2 years before being released. According to someone who has spoken to him since, he has never publicly admitted any wrongdoing. To this day, he believes he did nothing wrong, the source said. That's what I was told, anyway, by someone who's spoken to him directly since he got out. In the days leading up to his death, those closest to Michael say something felt different, even if nobody could quite name it at the time. He was reportedly on heavy amounts of medication just to fall asleep at night, medication typically reserved for hospital operating rooms, administered nightly by a physician living inside his home. We didn't think much of it, one source admitted. We didn't understand what that actually meant for his body. Then came a phone call that one person close to him still can't fully explain. Late on a Tuesday night, not long before he died, Michael reportedly called sounding erratic, almost frantic, the way he had once sounded during a previous incident overseas years earlier. When asked directly if he'd taken something, he allegedly answered calmly that a doctor had given it to him. He said something about the show possibly being pulled. He asked for his father's phone number, which struck the person on the other end of the line as strange, given how distant that relationship had reportedly become over the years. He spoke briefly to a child on the other end of the call before the conversation trailed off into confusion. I told him I was okay with it at first, the source said. But something about the whole call stayed with me. The way he sounded. The questions he was asking. It didn't feel like him. Looking back now, that source says the call reads differently than it did in the moment. At the time, it felt like a stressed man venting about a possible cancellation. In hindsight, it feels like someone reaching for anyone who might still be reachable, running through a short list of names, trying to find someone who could step in and steady things before it was too late. I've replayed that call more times than I can count, the source admitted. You always wonder if there was something you should have picked up on. Something you could have done differently. You never really let go of that. Not everyone close to Michael has been willing to speak in detail about what they believe really happened. One longtime collaborator, when asked directly who they believed was responsible for his death, declined to answer at all. That's something I don't want to get into, he said. I was pushed into that conversation before, and I had to walk it back. I have children. I have a career. I'm not going there again. Others have been far less careful. Some voices in the music industry openly argue that Michael's death was never really about medication at all, that it was about money, ownership, and control of some of the most valuable intellectual property in entertainment history. According to this theory, Michael's business instincts, not just his talent, made him a threat to people far more powerful than any single doctor. Buying that catalog. Reportedly outbidding a major artist to acquire the rights to another. Reportedly pursuing a deal to acquire a major comic book franchise around the same time serious allegations resurfaced against him publicly. To believers in this theory, the timing of these events is not a coincidence. To skeptics, it's a pattern people impose after the fact to make chaos feel like a conspiracy.